And he goes and he's meets with Mendelssohn, studies with Mendelssohn, he has all kinds of adventures and so on. And then he writes these memoirs. They become the paradigm that then other maskilim, enlighteners in the East, in the Pale, use, and they start writing about their lives, and in particular, they have this kind of model where they trace their odyssey from obscurity. Obscure in French means darkness, right? To light. So from this traditional Jewish, superstitious, fanatical, unenlightened culture to light and knowledge of European languages and knowledge of secular science, and away from all the benighted behavior of traditional Jews in the shtetl, including early childhood marriage to partners that they have you can't at the age of 12, right, have any kind of relationship with, but they marry them off very early, and that they start to critique, and they critique the whole structure of the traditional Jewish family and of Jewish education. The traditional cheder is an offense to human rights. There are all these depraved Melamdim who are hitting them and have no idea of what pedagogy is or should be, and have no understanding of what psychological development is in children, and the whole curriculum is inappropriate and abusive. This is what they write about in their memoirs. And then something happens, the intervention of something, including reading each other's memoirs, and they say, I can get out of this. And they seek enlightenment, and they get it, and they go through all kinds of travails and difficulties. Their families give them a hard time, their communities give them a hard time. They're boycotted, they aren't allowed to make a living, they're martyrs. But it is all, in the quest for enlightenment, and they're heroes or whatever. And that's kind of, it creates a paradigm of these kinds of memoirs. And they are, some of them are a little older than Wengeroff, some of them are a little younger than she is, but they're her age contemporaries, and she's well aware of them. And so when she writes memoirs, that's another question. Like what are her precedents? What's in her mind when she's doing this? So she writes the first volume of her memoirs. A lot of it is devoted to describing the cycle of a year in her parents' home, and it was a very pious, traditional home, very wealthy. The father was a Podrachik, a contractor for the Tsar for building enterprises, roads, forts, a lot of that going on in the 19th century for security reasons, and they're wealthy. But she insists that he was a scholar first. He was a lay scholar, so he wasn't a rabbi out in the community, but he learned and he studied, and she associated his name with the yeshiva in Volozhin, which is the Yale of yeshivas in Eastern Europe. And there's no doubt in my mind from the details that she provides us that he went there and he studied there as a married man, which was part of the culture. He wrote later in his life 2 published works of halachic material. I looked at them, I certainly haven't read them, they're like this, but enough. They're very scholarly. That's her father, and then she writes a great deal about her mother, who kind of preceded Wengeroff in formidableness, if that's a word. And she'd scare me if I came near her. She depicts her as a woman of just formidable authority in the home, who lorded it over servants, of whom they had many. Big household, a lot of kids, and by the time Wengeroff is writing, she is, as if I'm gathering straight, is about the 6th or the 7th in the birth order. For somebody who's writing memoirs of a grandmother, and you would know this, I spent a lot of time trying to make sense. How many siblings did she have? How many brothers? How many sisters? In what birth order? What names? I mean, she does not make a clear point of that, which raises questions and tells you something. But anyway, And by the time she writes with the consciousness of a 6-, 7-year-old, she has several older sisters who are married. They're married young, obviously. They and their husbands are living with Wengeroff and her family, which is typical East European Jewish behavior. It's an institution called Pest, where the families, children marry young, and then in middle class and above, obviously poor people can't do this, but middle class and above, usually, not always, the bride's family, it's written into the marriage contract, that they support the young couple for several years. I mean, if you're 13, 14, you get me, right? They're supported, they live with them, they have room and board. The son-in-law is expected to study Talmud, and then at a certain point they or their parents, the other set of parents, will set them up in some kind of business when they're ready, whatever. And that's clearly what's going on. So there's a big household with several generations and servants, and she depicts the mother. The mother is a central character in the memoir, as lording it over this house and kashrus, and any infraction coming down, mercilessly on servants. Various examples of this, and stringencies that are not only interesting for their halachic character, but they're costly. Right? If you declare that an entire set of turkeys that have been slaughtered for Passover are not kosher because you found in the gullet of one of them something that might be this much chametz, and you say all of them, which her mother does, are chametz, and you have to slaughter a whole, only wealthy people, very wealthy people, could do that. So it testifies to two things: that she was, in my opinion, a religious fanatic, and two, that they were wealthy, and three, she wasn't asking her husband, she was doing it on her own authority. She doesn't say anything without asking the husband, she just does it. And there were various other examples of that kind of thing too, where she does things, and you wonder, like, where is he in all of this? And clearly, he's not whatever. I mean, it's her domain. So what we learn from this is that traditional parents, mother has a lot of power in a certain domain, but nonetheless. And then what Wengeroff does in the first volume is kind of give us this cycle of a Jewish year. She talks about a daily cycle. They didn't tell time. It's not 7:30 at night. It's Mariv Zeit, or it's Mincha Zeit, or it's Shachar. That's what they would do. They would tell time by the Jewish, by the prayer times, and so on. And each of the holidays starts out, I think, talking about Hanukkah, and then Purim, a huge thing about Pesach, like pages and pages about all of the details about Pesach, and then the calendar of the year. She would just go through it, and she would narrate what they did in her family with these holidays. So what she's doing is kind of intertwining stories about her family, but clearly to me, uppermost in the whole thing is to project to some audience, here's what these holidays are. To a point where, my students notice this, and it's absolutely true, she gives you recipes for making latkes. And she tells you what a lot of attention to the meals and the food, tremendous amount of attention and detail to it. To the point where, it's very interesting, honestly, when you work on somebody, you get a little bit enmeshed, and then if you're doing it right, you then move back a little bit and you kind of put some distance. But for a while there, I was very enmeshed with her. And one Friday, I made the huge mistake of attempting to make the fish that I understood that she had made. Father liked a lot of pepper in the fish. I mean, it was inedible. I mean, if you wanted to, like, kill your guests, this was a shortage. But, so she's using her family, but she's clearly using them in order to convey cultural information. So what kind of audience needs that?
Non-Jews.
Either non-Jews.
Well, both.
Other families.
Less prosperous Jews would be interested in that too.
Okay.
People outside the church.
Okay. Or people who are assimilated.
Right.
People who have become attenuated and don't know.